Hey, how's it going everyone? Today we're going to be installing the S30 240Z 260Z 280Z front and rear sway bars. So we got the 240Z sway bars in front of us here. This is the front sway bar. It's a lot thicker than the rear sway bar. This is the rear sway bar. Today we're going to be going through the hardware of the rear sway bar as well as the front sway bar. So you'll notice you have two of these drop legs to mount the rear sway bar. Now this is going to be mounting onto our rear subframe, so we are not going to be needing these guys. And the other thing is, because we're going to be installing these onto our Apex engineered front lower control arms, we will not be reusing the sway bar links that are supplied with the ST sway bars, but instead use the sway bar links that we are going to be supplying with the control arms. Now, if you did want to reuse them onto the factory control arms, you'll notice you have the hole here, and the sway bar link would just be put into place like this with the bushings on the top and the bottom and the stud going through it. So now we're going to go ahead and get these out of the way, and now on the table what's going to be left is just going to be the hardware and the bolts that we're going to need to mount the sway bars onto our suspension kits. So the first thing we're going to go through is the front hardware. We got the 4 washers, the 4 bolts, and 2 sway bar brackets or bushings. Now we're going to go ahead and mount these 2 bolts on, and then followed by the bushings and then the sway bar. You'll also notice that this sway bar in the front is going to be about 1 inch in diameter, and the rear is going to be about 3/4. They both are really good high performing sway bars that do offer quite a bit of adjustability as well as torsional resistance. So the first thing we're going to do is grab the bushing, and then you usually would grease the inside of the bushing, but for the sake of this video we're not going to get our hands dirty and do that. The bushings open up to allow the sway bar to go in. Now you can see the other side we already have put in. We're going to slide the bushing around it, followed by the clamp, and then go ahead and bolt those to the car chassis as well. Now we like to have that notch pointed outside. I don't really think it matters, but maybe for aesthetics it was just something we noticed that we like to do. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten the bolts down onto the frame, and then once those are tight you can go ahead and bolt the sway bar to the actual control arm as well. So we just took off the sway bar off the control arm. You'll notice here that this is the bolt hole that we're going to select. We're going to loosen up the bolt and remove it. That way we have the opportunity to just put the sway bar in between the 2 bushings. Now we took the bushing from one side out, and then we're going to slide the bushing from the top and from the bottom back onto that bolt. Then apply the jam nut following that. And then we can go ahead and tighten the sway bar link to the bolt itself. Now here's where it takes a little bit of effort. You gotta line these up pretty well. Sometimes you gotta adjust your caster arm in and out just to get those at a perfect fitting. And then once you get those in there, you can go ahead and slide the socket head bolt through. Now you'll notice that we have multiple holes on the control arm, and that's just to change as you widen and shorten your track width. But in this one, we're going to bring it to the factory level, and we're going to use the frontmost hole. Go ahead and use your Allen key to bring that in. All right, so then here we're going to use our 9/16 wrench and our Allen key and tighten up the socket head bolt onto the nut. And then on the top, we also have a 9/16 socket that we're going to use to tighten up along with the 9/16 wrench. But in this case, we noticed that we were able to tighten the bolt without using the wrench on the jam nut. Now once all that's tight, we can go ahead and do that same thing to the other side. So here, if you purchase the 240Z sway bar, even if you have a 280Z, but if you purchase it with our subframe, you can run a 240Z sway bar in the rear. The subframe is going to come with 2 of these sway bar shims. Now those shims may be needed, maybe not needed, depends on the ride height that you choose to go with. But for this customer, he's not going with a very low ride height, so we're going to add these shims on there. And those shims are going to be placed right where the subframe sway bar mounts would go, followed by the bushing. Now this is the bushing. Here we're going to go ahead and not lube the inside or grease the inside, but for permanent use you would. We're going to slide the bushing onto the sway bar. Alright, so once you slip the bushing onto the sway bar and followed by the sway bar clamps, you can go ahead and grab those 2 sway bar spacers and put them behind. Now one thing you'll notice is that ST provides 3/8 16 pitch bolt. Now we're going to go ahead and use longer bolts because we are using the sway bar spacers. You may or may not need those, but one thing to know, you might have to run to the hardware store and just get slightly longer bolts if you're running the sway bar spacers. The ST washer and the ST nut will still work because they are still the 3/8 16 thread, but just note you might have to get longer bolts. So next we're going to go ahead and install the link. Now you'll notice that it has these cups and the bushings, a spacer, another set of washers, and the bushings again. The sway bar is going to sit in between the bushings, and then in between the bushings is going to be the control arm on the bottom. So here we're going to go ahead and slide the bushing on top and a bushing on the bottom, followed by the spacer, and then the bushing on top of the control arm and the bushing on the bottom of the control arm, and go ahead and tighten that using the 9/16 wrench and socket. And then finally torque all the nuts and bolts down to about 30 foot-pounds for the rear and 40 foot-pounds for the bushings. And that's pretty much all there is really to it. It's a bolt-on ordeal. Now always remember, if you have the 240Z and you have our subframe kit, you can just bolt it right to the back. And even if you had a 280Z and you had our subframe kit, you can still run a 240Z sway bar, which makes it really easy to just drop your whole suspension kit using the 6 bolts on the subframe rather than unbolting your sway bar and unbolting the subframe. And that's about wraps up the install of the front and rear sway bar. Hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, always give us a call and email. Don't forget to subscribe.